Oh, cool. All right. Okay.
That's impressive, Mako.
So, Taneva and Caleb, you might want to sit at the end. Yeah. Oh, okay.
That's impressive. And very smart.
Oh, what's going on here?
Huh? I mean, just the whole. I was
Sorry.
always come up with that as a plan.
You gotta adjust what comes out of the screen. Huh. Why is that not showing up?
Has anybody done this series already?
I haven't even seen it.
Oh, okay. What?
You mean Black
This
Panther?
is like the season premiere.
No.
What do they call it? Not the season premiere. What do they call it? The world premiere.
No.
It's the world premiere of the Black Panther documentary. It's like when they talk about Gillette World Headquarters. They're like, nobody's buying Gillette. All of them.
What? What is going on?
You know how they
What's wrong?
Or like the World Series. The whole world is not playing baseball right now. It's just y'all.
Who said they were gonna come down?
Hello. Come on.
That said she wanted to come down. 'Cause I think she's done.
Are you gonna be
Ah.
still teaching this too at the church in was it Cambridge? What's the name of that church?
Abundant life?
Yes.
Hopefully.
She was my friend. My friend goes to that church.
Yeah.
I told her about it. And they were saying, she was like, "Oh, that'd be exciting."
All right. Sorry for the delay, friends.
So, Mako, is your theory that this theology is on purpose?
That it's. I'll get into that a little bit, but more so that it's unavoidable.
Ah.
Okay. So for the recording, this is Neighborhood Church's Sunday night community group. Woo! And we're gonna explore the theology of the Black Panther. You might hear kids in the background. And there will be, this is half of the presentation, and there's like 2 discussion points. So I want to prep you that I would love to, have you thinking, and I would love to hear what your thoughts are after kind of segment 1 and segment 2. Okay, so why do this, and why am I excited to do this? Hopefully, why are you excited to listen in? Why talk about Black Panther? I could think of a number of reasons. One is it's a really, really powerful commentary on our modern political and racial situations. That's number one. Number two is it's a really good exploration, or at least an opportunity to talk about the relationship between, in this case, African Americans and Africans, or, as someone of Asian descent, a diaspora people, and people at the origins, right, or at historic origins of where that people came from. And so I just really appreciated the dialogue, there. And then thirdly, because it's a great story, it's like an amazing story. So what this is not about, to Shauna's point, this is not about Ryan Coogler and his original intent or a secret intention that he has. Ryan Coogler is the director of Marvel's Black Panther. I will say, though, that he grew up in Oakland and went to a Catholic high school, and so I think he's pretty familiar with the Christian story and Christian faith, and that's why I say I think it's somewhat unavoidable that both his faith exposure and also growing up as an African American in Oakland would engage with some of these things. So I'm not claiming that I know his secret intention, or that he ever made any. He didn't make any comments about the movie to that effect. But I want to explore just what the context that he's swimming in, what he had to work with, and why the story had to go in a certain direction. So secondly, it's not a prediction about the Marvel universe. I really enjoy the movies, but I'm going to treat this movie as a self-contained story. And third, it's not an exploration of African, like traditional religious ideas and images. Although that I've seen at least one take on that effect. It was really interesting. But sadly, it's not primarily about that. This presentation. All right. So what is it about? It's an analysis of Black Panther as a commentary on real history and real events. I mean, that's how the story itself positions the story. And what I'm really going to do is analyze Black Panther as a story. Next week, we'll talk about what makes a hero and what makes a villain. In this case, I put villain in quotes because when we talk about Killmonger, he's not. It's not easy to just call him a villain. So we'll get into that. It's really, really fascinating to compare T'Challa and Killmonger. But more so, what are good and evil? So what are the principles of good and evil? How do we see good and evil relate to one another? And how can good defeat evil without becoming evil itself? That's one of the central thrusts of the story. And then, of course, I want to compare Black Panther to the Bible as a story because it'll illuminate some things about the story and about our Christian faith that I think will make us more attentive, really, even to things in Scripture and things that we say we believe. It'll be fun. So, to begin with, Black Panther is this commentary on modern political events. The basic conflict, right, is between three positions about, like, how do we relate to other people? And King T'Chaka, who is T'Challa's father, represents isolationism. Like, he's the Wakandan who says, no, let's be separate from the world. I'm blanking. What's her name? Nakia, sorry. Nakia represents involvement, right? She's the character she's the one who actually left her position in the among the warrior women, the Dora Milaje, and goes out to fight like human trafficking, and we actually see what she's up to at first. Like, she's a spy, but she's making use of those skills to benefit the world. And Killmonger represents the imperialism option, or empire building. Let's actually take our technology, gifts, skills, and resources to build an empire, to conquer other people, and that in that way protect ourselves. Right? So there's a tension between these characters, and the main character T'Challa has to choose between these three basic options, right? Okay, so here are some other touch points to kind of modern day political questions that we're wrestling with. The fear of immigration, right? There's this one line about how if you let the world into Wakanda, they'll bring their problems, and some of the characters are afraid of that. They don't want that. That's the problem of reverse immigration. Instead of just going out and conquering, you're allowing other people in, and to some, that's a frightening idea. So at the end of Black Panther, T'Challa says, "The wise build bridges, the foolish build barriers," and of course that's a comment on the idea of Trump's wall, right, on the Mexico-U.S. border. Well, why would we do that, and is that even effective? Another touch point to colonialism, imperialism, is that Ulysses Klaue, the early main villain, is a white South African. And he's after vibranium, which is the precious resource of Wakanda. Right, and this is actually from Age of Ultron, a previous movie where he is basically weaponizing vibranium, and he's saying, like, we can make a lot of money, people will kill each other over this, and we just become famous. So he's already at work doing this. And many of the characters in the orbit of Wakanda are afraid of this. They're like, well, what's going to happen to us if these weapons get turned against us, or if people know that we have this precious metal, this precious resource, are they going to invade us? Right? So this is part of the whole crisis of, well, what do we do? Another touch point with colonialism is this scene where Eric Stevens, later known as Killmonger, corrects the Museum of Great Britain curator about the artifacts lifted from their origins. Right? So the fact that the British Museum has these artifacts is a legacy of their imperialism. They took over these lands, raided things from people, enslaved people, and took these artifacts, and now it's in a museum, right? And so this scene is powerful because the white woman who's the curator says, yes, I know about these objects and blah, 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 but Killmonger corrects her and says, actually, you're wrong about this item. It's the vibranium axe. I know where this is from, and then he takes over. So that's a powerful scene because this is one of the ongoing questions of colonialism in the past centuries. I think the Museum of France decided recently to give back some artifacts that they had taken from a West African context. Also, Killmonger says, the sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire, right? Because his position is, let's weaponize what we have and let's become an empire, an imperial power. That is a twist of a quote from, I'm not sure exactly who said this in the British imperial times, but someone said, the sun will never set on the British Empire. And it was true, right? This was the British Empire at one point in history, all across the globe, raiding raw materials. There's also this motif of the Black Panthers, and is it possible to overturn colonialism and imperialism from within, right? If you are the oppressed people, can you do that? Let's see. There's a couple motifs early on in the Oakland scene. The movie starts in Oakland. You see the apartment of Njobu, and this poster is on his wall, right? So there's Public Enemy. They were talking about the police and how the police are just terrorists terrorizing the black community. So there's a nod to that. That's a real concern. I think, what was the setting of the movie to begin with? The 80s? I forget. Mid-80s, I think. And then the wicker basket of Huey Newton, one of the leaders of the Black Panther, was a model for the throne of T'Challa. Right? So you see that paired up, and it's an iconic image. So this is really important because the actual historic Black Panther Party didn't have anything to do with the naming of the original Marvel Black Panther character. It was more or less coincidental. Although Marvel did have to wrestle with, like, do we still want to go with this name, because now there's this very strong association, and courageously they decided to stick with it. Although I think they were flirting with the idea of a black jaguar or something like that. So, but they went back to Black Panther. The actual Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s were primarily about food, stopping police brutality in the black community, starting in Oakland, and later, as the civil rights movement in some ways accomplished some goals, but in other ways fizzled out, and in the early 70s there was the rise of the Black Power movement, that the Black Panther Party was kind of faced with these two options that are in a simplistic sense is embodied by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, right? Are we going to go with the violent route at one point? That was the position of Malcolm X, or the nonviolent reconciliation, still call for justice, work within the system, political means, type of approach. So in some sense, this represents the imperialism versus the involvement, right? Like that camp. Isolationism, not an option. We're past that point that we can't do anymore. So here are two options. The reason I think that this is in some ways an unavoidable conversation, the theology becomes an unavoidable part of the conversation, is because of the actual role of Christian faith in the 20th century, not just in the civil rights movement in the US through the Black church, which we can appreciate very deeply, but actually as part of this silver thread that runs through the 20th century, because Christians were involved in nonviolent resistance movements throughout the entire 20th century. So I'm going to give a little bit of a rundown of that and then pause for some discussion. So this is Leo Tolstoy, or a picture of him. After he wrote War and Peace in Russia, he became a Christian and wrote a book, or wrote a few things, one of which was called The Kingdom of God is Within You. And he was involved in helping Russian peasants resist the oppression of the Russian nobles because of how they monopolized land. And so he was helping them, and his writings became very famous around the world. So he would focus on Jesus's love your enemies, but not in a be a doormat kind of sense, but actually love your enemies into the kingdom and into loving others. So love being a part of a Christian reconciliation movement. His writings landed on the desk of Mahatma Gandhi in South Africa when he was trying to think about, well, how do we deal with the kind of the proto-apartheid type situation in South Africa. And Gandhi and Tolstoy wrote letters back and forth. Gandhi was at the time a Hindu, but he realized that he could not rely on the Bhagavad Gita in order to call for change and a new social movement, because the Hindu caste system legitimates war, right? The warriors are the second caste right underneath the priests. So he's like, I don't think I have much to go with here. And we can't beat the British anyway, so if violence was an option, I wouldn't choose it. So what do we do? Well, he actually relied on Tolstoy and Jesus, and so he would go from train stop to train stop talking about the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is teaching about love your enemy, reconcile, call them to repent to, and so he did that. Went back to India and led, in some ways, a successful nonviolent resistance against the British and won Indian independence. There's a lot more to that. I put an asterisk by his name because, to my knowledge, or to anyone's knowledge, it's not that he became a believer in Jesus, but he did use Jesus' teaching when it seems like it was the best option for him, right? And later on, he became a kind of a nation builder and persecuted Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims. So that's a sad thing that's not often remembered about him, but he did do that in India. But leading up to that point, this is pretty important to study. An Chang-ho in Korea, under Japanese imperialist occupation, Korea led an independence movement. And so in 1919, there was a gathering of folks inside Korea. 50% of the signers of the Korean Declaration of Independence were Christian, even though only 1% of the total population of Korea was Christian. And that's because Christians essentially ran the schools in Korea. And that was one of the first things that the Japanese government wanted to shut down, is we want to shut down Korean culture. We want to commit cultural genocide. And so the Korean Christians mobilized very quickly and very strongly against that. And they marched and eventually won international support for their independence movement. So that was really important. Then, of course, there's lots of figures in the black church in the United States. This is James Lawson, who actually went to observe Gandhi in India, came back and taught those methods to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And this is when he got impounded, and this was him as an older man. Of course, King and Lawson talked at length about how to put those nonviolent practices into to work here in the U.S. And this picture is of Ruby Bridges. She was the little girl who integrated the Franz School in New Orleans after Brown v. Board of Education. Really courageous family, very Christian, and how they talk about like the relying on God and praying for the white protest, the parents protesting her arrival at school. It's amazing. Then in 1986, this happens. I'm still looking into what the connections, the actual people connections were. I've heard that there were some. But essentially, this is the people power revolution in the Philippines. And essentially, the Philippines were ruled by the Marcoses, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. They were dictators backed by the United States. Imelda Marcos had like 3,000 pairs of shoes, and Ferdinand Marcos had siphoned off billions of dollars from the country, while half the country was in poverty, right, like into his own bank account. And so there was an opposition to this. Corazon Aquino's husband, Ninoy Aquino, they were both here actually in Boston for a while in exile, and they decided to go back so he could run against Marcos for president. Of course, knowing that it would be rigged, that he might even be killed. He was killed as he got off the plane, right, in Manila. It was just shocking. The response was that Corazon Aquino actually decided to run for president. She had never held political office. Actually, she'd been a wife and mother full time, and she became famous though for her yellow dresses. She always wore yellow dresses, so that became really popular. The entire Catholic Church backed her, and one of the sayings was, Marcos has the guns, but Aquino has the nuns. And it was powerful because two of Marcos's leading generals defected, and Marcos sent the entire army through the streets of Manila, chasing them down and trying to shut down the election. And then the Catholic bishop got on the radio and said, everyone get out into the streets, block the tanks. So this is an actual picture of nuns. There are priests, there are people in wheelchairs. They get out and they stick flowers into gun nozzles and tank cannons. They had no training in nonviolent protesting, but this is what they did. And the army refused to fire a shot on their own people. Marcos and his wife fled the country, came here and to Boston, where Tufts University actually offered to let him endow a chair. And the Tufts campus just erupted in protest. That didn't happen. So, but essentially this was called the Bloodless Revolution. And it's inspired by this string of Christian activity throughout the century. Later, there's Solidarity in Poland. This is Lech Walesa, who I think didn't even have a high school diploma. He was an electrician, led this anti-Soviet Labor Party, won, and then Poland suddenly became a stable democracy overnight, right, after Soviet occupation for decades. Just incredible stuff. And Solidarity and the Catholic Church worked very closely because they were the only, the Catholic Church was the only organization allowed to function independently of the Soviet state. So that's incredible. This is the beginning of the Velvet Revolutions that swept Eastern Europe in Czechoslovakia at the time before it divided into two countries peacefully. These movements started when students realized that the government might arrest their pastors. And so they gathered around the house to pray and to block any government authorities from coming in to arrest their pastors. That's how it started. And then this swelled, and then all of these, Soviet bloc, Eastern European countries transitioned into democracies. It was incredible. Then there's the post-conflict situations in South Africa, also Rwanda and Uganda. This is Bishop Desmond Tutu, Anglican bishop in South Africa. He and many other Christian leaders designed truth and reconciliation commissions after apartheid because so many people had done wrong, you couldn't physically imprison people. Otherwise, because you'd run out of space and you'd bankrupt your country anyway. So what do you do when you have that kind of problem? Well, you set up a different kind of resolution so that people can come clean and confess, and that's the truth part, and also the victim can get closure, at least by hearing the admission of guilt. And then the victim also gets to say, will get to say, well, this is what I need in order to move forward in life. So there's a story of, Philip Yancey tells a story of one woman who, black South African woman, who confronts the white police officer who killed both her husband and their son and burned their bodies to ashes in order to hide the evidence. So he comes clean and admits that he did this. What she says is, she's a Christian, and she says so, and she says, well, look, I would like you to help me bury my husband and son in a proper burial. So come with me and gather their ashes with me. And furthermore, I have a lot of love to give, and I would like you to get to know my community. So something like one Saturday every month, I want you to come over for a meal and spend time with me and my community. And then the court, according to the story, bursts out singing "Amazing Grace." The police officer just collapses, faints in his chair. But those are the kinds of moments that this structure allowed for. I'm not saying that every situation was like that, but it allowed for a certain kind of reconciliation to happen, and it was developed by Christian leaders who were using principles of repentance and reconciliation, and saying, why don't we do this as an entire country? So many thanks to them, and I feel like that's been one of the gifts that I've taken away from my visit to Uganda in 2012 and studying some of these things is the reconciliation movement. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in African countries is a gift to the rest of the world. This is Lema Bowie in Liberia. She is famous for leading a sex strike. So during the Civil War in Liberia, the Christian women gathered and decided we are going to not be intimate with our husbands until they help bring an end to this conflict. It was amazing. Yeah. And that was one of the not the only thing, but one of the factors that kind of raised the bar, right, for the rest of the country to do things. They actually reached out to Muslim women too and got them to do it. And Lema Bowie won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And I think this is her book, Mighty Be Our Powers, but there's a DVD called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which is all about this time in the Liberian Civil War and its ending. So, incredible women of God who did that. So that's really important for us to keep in mind, because this is the context of Black Panther, right? And because of what it's commenting on, what it's drawing from in terms of the whole Malcolm Martin dialogue, what the historic Black Panther Party did, And it's important for us because this is our context too. And this is a decent snapshot of modern, modern concerns about war, conflict, state-sponsored terrorism, and racism, and all these things. So if you look, I mean, this is collected by a historian at the University of Hawaii. These are war-related deaths every century. 16th century, 1.6, 17th, 6.1, 18th, 7.0, 19th, 19.4, and the 20th century, 108 million. And that's a conservative estimate because we don't really know how many people Stalin killed or how many people Mao Zedong killed or, Pol Pot in Cambodia. We just have to make some educated guesses. But why did this happen? Or this is horrible. And I have to say, this is not just because of the atomic bomb. Most of these people died by famine that was imposed on them by their government or by machete. Right? And I think the real causes are nation building and organized atheism. So that's the context. Now, again, we have to look at Jesus' context in much the same way. Why were these Christian nonviolent reconciliation movements so prominent and so effective in the 20th century? And by the way, there were many others. I'm just highlighting the ones that were quote unquote successful in secular terms. There's many other people, churches, Christian organizations that tried to do things and didn't succeed in that sense. But why were they suddenly launched off with such clarity and such precision? Well, it's because that was the original context of Jesus and the early Christians, right? Where the colonizing power was the Roman Empire, and then you have this oppressed minority, Israel. They were waiting for a king or a military leader or some kind of champion to champion their cause, which winds up being Jesus, although there were other people who claimed that role. The opponents to Jesus were the ethno-nationalists, like the Pharisees. Right? How many of us have heard of the Pharisees being called ethno-nationalists? No, we usually think of it. We usually think of like Jesus's debate with the Pharisees as if we were reliving Martin Luther's debate with the Catholic Church in the 1500s. That's not actually what was going on. People weren't concerned just about individual salvation, like how do I personally get saved? It was no, who's the people of God? Like who are they and what are we supposed to do? So the Pharisees believed that Israel should be defined biologically and racially, right, as an ethnicity. There were the militarists, the extreme folks called zealots who would take up arms. And then there was the compromisers, like the Sadducees and the priests in Jerusalem. And they would change Jewish beliefs and say we need to get used to Roman occupation. And so what's at stake is this definition of good and evil. What is good and evil here? Jesus said that the battle between good and evil is within human nature. It's within every person, and it's in everyone. And so he wanted to engage with every single person. The opposing camps would say, no, the battle between good and evil lies between people, right? It's we Jews, or at least faithful Jews, or pious Jews, or Torah-observing Jews, we're on one side, we're on the good side. Everyone else, like Jewish compromisers and then the Roman Empire, they're evil. And the battle line is And so you could read more about this. I have this whole thing, especially on the nonviolent resistance movement. But I'd like us to talk about this. This is, again, the context of Black Panther and our context. Have you heard of this history before? And what questions does it leave you with? So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. I'd love to hear what is going on in your heads.
Want to sit down, Stan?
I'm going to use the bathroom when I come back out.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about organized atheism? What do you mean?
Well, Marxism,
Okay.
Stalin, Lenin.
Okay.
There's that China
Okay.
in the Cultural Revolution, tried to eliminate beliefs. Cambodia,
Okay.
Albania was the first atheist state. Yeah. My thoughts.
A lot of good information. I think I've heard some of the history before, but not all of it.
Anyways, we think Black Panthers is eventually split. With Bobby Seale and
Right.
Huey Newton.
Yeah. Who went which way?
I can't remember.
Forget.
I think Huey Newton was peaceful. I think Bobby Seale eventually.
Was the militant one?
Yeah, but the Black Panther Party eventually split because of those two
Mm.
reasons.
Mm.
And that was the event. I think that was the event, one of the main causes of the downfall of the Black Panther Party. Besides, obviously, police and white supremacy, but
Right,
it kind of
right.
like imploded
Uh,
because it was like there were one saying we need like violent resistance.
Wow.
Another saying, so it seems like it's a similar,
yeah.
a newer similar.
Yeah. Similar dynamic.
Yeah.
I'm struck by how white my understanding of world history is. Right? Like there's a lot of this that I didn't
Yeah.
know, and like Asia is totally off my map in terms of revolutions, which is crazy given that that's where most of the world's people are, right? So that it was sort of like, whoa, there's a whole world out there, and it's just not. They're not stories that like. And I think I heard, you know what I mean, like Time magazine covers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I think I might have seen that picture, but the substance of the story, not
Right.
part of my repertoire.
Right. And Corazon Aquino became the first female president in any country in Asia. Right, and just incredible. Also incredible because the Philippines was also a colonized country, right? So their understanding of Christian faith had to develop from that context, but eventually emerged. What emerged was, especially in that moment, I would argue, authentic Christian faith.
Yeah.
Right, similar to Korea.
So you said you had mentioned Gandhi later on.
Yep.
Persecuted Christians.
Yeah, yeah.
That's something that I did not know.
Yeah, in the West, we tend to remember Gandhi as this great hero. You know, like we only remember maybe the first 2/3 of his life, essentially, because he, at that time, he stood for things that, you know, we in the West kind of would also stand for freedom, independence, right, freedom from oppression, sovereignty, and things like that. Later on, yeah, I mean, he persecuted Buddhists, Muslims, Christians. There's a really powerful story about Bishop V.S. Azariah, who's the first Indian bishop, I think in the Anglican Church there in India. And he was helping thousands of Indians, especially Dalits and lower caste Indians, come to Christ. And Gandhi called him enemy number one. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we tend to not know this history or put it together in this particular way, but this is Christian history. So it's world history, but it's also Christian history, and I think it's really important to know. And you know, we can see in Black Panther kind of this microcosm, right? Of this is playing out here, because if countries were individuals or boiled them down to individuals, then you know, the isolationist would be kind of the person who withdraws, like I don't want to be there. And then the imperialist is the person who thinks, if I control other people, then I'll be safe. And then the person, the Nakia character is the involvement. Like, well, I'm going to get involved. I'm sure I'll get hurt by doing this, but more good than evil will result. Right? And so that's what I feel called to do.
So, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, because I know you said this isn't so much described like what the director was trying to do or what he took from it, but you were gonna say, like, for the movie Black Panther, and if you were gonna kind of mirror it to like Christianity or whatever,
Yeah.
what would they have been protecting from the outside?
Like the vibranium.
Yeah.
And, well, it's their vibranium,
Uh-huh.
but they're also trying to protect the world from what it could become in the worst possible sense.
Right, but I'm saying along the lines like as
As a
Christians,
Christian.
right?
If you were making
Uh,
a Christian parallel.
If you were gonna make it like, because you know there are some religious groups who believe that everybody outside of us
Yeah.
is the enemy,
Yeah.
whereas Jesus was the opposite. Where he was just like, those are the people that we need to go out and seek.
Right.
So, I
Right.
don't know.
It's more of an analogy, right? Like they're.
Right.
I mean, I think in some ways, American Christianity already is a little bit like that. Sort of its isolationism. You know, we're going to look at spiritual things.
Today,
We're
yeah.
not talking about,
Yeah.
you know, social justice as much.
Right.
You know, we're caring more about how we are internally,
Right.
or even.
Well, I think even too, when you look at American Christianity, that happens within Christianity
Yes.
too, right? Because you have different forms of, you know, Christians and churches and, you know, so it's not so much that it's the body, but it's a broken body.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, it's, you know, if you don't believe in this and this one and this way, then you aren't our type of Christian. Southern Christian versus Northern Christian. Seventh Day Adventist versus Jehovah's Witness. Like, there's so many things. And I think it's interesting too. I think I understand the idea of wanting to kind of contain, like, you know, these things for us. Because when you look at, like, Christianity, I think this is the point that I was trying to make, is like when you look at Christianity and how, you know, you try to spread the gospel, you try to, you know, get Jesus' message across, how so many people have turned it into a weapon. Because
Yeah.
Christianity has become a weapon
Yeah.
in some ways, you know.
Yeah.
It's also super striking that like you can see through your example the power of Jesus' message to do good, and to see how the church, right? So you think about now when you think about the church's involvement in politics, you think about like the courts, right? You think about sort of the right using Christianity
Yeah.
to move in that way, and it's a very interesting reaction to the use of the love of Jesus to create a more just world. Like I don't think I saw that as the backlash that it is. I mean, I guess if I thought about it longer, I would have. But it's very clear that that the Pharisees
Yeah.
got in charge.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Of the move, like they were like, it's a little too much Jesus. We're gonna need to get some
Right.
rules in here.
Right.
Right, like, and so when you frame it in this way of the roles of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Zealots,
Right.
and then the Jesus followers,
Right.
that you can think about Christianity in those ways. But it's really interesting, I think, to think about contemporary, like
Oh yeah.
that we're still in a battle over the name of Jesus, right, and what
Yeah.
Christianity really means.
Yeah. Well, you know, the Pharisees are they show up a lot in the New Testament, but they weren't yet the most powerful group in Judaism, right? They would have wanted to be, but the most powerful group was the coastal elites, the globalizers, the Sadducees and the priests in Jerusalem, because they had power from the Romans to rule, right? And so I'm using that a little mischievously, but it's not really the same. But the Pharisees were like, we need to intensify our piety, but also purify the nation, right? We need to get rid of somehow, whether by arguing them to death, or just saying they're no longer Jews, or whatever, because of this idea of a covenant people. Okay, so that's the topic I want to hit next, is why is there an attraction to believe in a certain type of chosen people story, right, and a covenant people story. Now, this is not to impugn the real covenant, the Sinai covenant, in starting from the book of Exodus, but the way that I'm gonna show some things about that mirror Wakanda, or are mirrored in Wakanda, and the how Wakanda is portrayed, because this is one of the coolest, one of the most intriguing aspects of Black Panther, is what's with the some people call it Afrofuturism, but why is Wakanda so intriguing, right, to people? So let's do that. I think there is an actual parallel to Ethiopia going on, because Ethiopia was never colonized. It was defeated occasionally militarily, but it was never colonized. And so even when Black Panther was coming out, I saw a few articles relating Ethiopia and seeing, like, appreciating Ethiopian imagery, which we'll take a look at in the art and clothing of Black Panther. And so, just as an example, again, in the real world, Jewish Ethiopians are fascinating. They trace their lineage back to the Queen of Sheba showing up at the court of Solomon, King Solomon in Israel, and supposedly having a child with him. And then later, like, there's this story, you can't confirm or deny, that the Ark of the Covenant made its way to Ethiopia because Babylon took over, leveled Jerusalem and the temple, and the Ark had to go somewhere. And so there was an understanding that, hey, there's some Ethiopian Jews there, maybe we should go there. So, and supposedly it's in this temple, or a kind of synagogue-like structure, but no one can go there except one person go in. And then there was this mystique about Haile Selassie, right? The emperor, the last emperor of Ethiopia, who was supposedly part of that line. He was a son of David. And so the Rastafarians looked at him and said, oh, look, he is our savior. Like, here's this country. Is an example of an African people who've never been conquered, and this is like the Messiah. And Haile Selassie was so mortified by this that he asked the bishop, the archbishop of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, to go, like, spread the gospel and tell people not to worship him in the Caribbean. And so in the last, like, 2 years of his life, Bob Marley came to Jesus in the context of conversation with the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, and he says, like, everyone should believe in Jesus. It's like fabulous statement. So, and unfortunately he died within about 1.5 years. But I mean, so there's this mystique, right? Like, but why? And what does it tell us about ourselves? I mean, and especially if you're of African descent, like, is that important? To what extent, and what could it be revealing? So here's a scene where I think this is the merchant tribe. She's the elder of the merchant tribe, and she is wearing an Ethiopian cross. This is the Ethiopian cross, like, that gets carried into service and processions and things. And this is one of the churches, the famous churches in Ethiopia, that are carved out of rock. Like, they dug through here and chiseled this hole around one piece of rock, and that is a church. And it's like 3 or 4 stories. It's beautiful. It's really deep. It's incredible. And so there's a lot of good pictures on the web. But essentially, this is one of the wonders, the glories, the amazing things about Ethiopian Christianity. is that they did stuff like this. Beautiful architecture. Their paintings from ancient times all the way up to today, very colorful. I should have stuck it in, but yeah, amazing. So I think Wakanda to some degree is patterned after the idea of kind of Ethiopia and Israel. Someone at our door.
Kids are playing.
Oh, okay. How is that? So I'm going to list a few aspects of Wakanda, and we'll compare them to Israel, like biblical Israel. So there is a gift from above, the vibranium. Actually, I'll just go through the slide. Okay, so first and foremost, there is a gift from above, right? In the beginning, opening credits, there's a huge, like, asteroid of vibranium that lands in Wakanda, and it changes the plant life, the mineral life, the people who eventually interact with this stuff, discover its properties, and they come to some kind of understanding about this vibranium. And this is a picture of the mines that they're still digging. Israel also received a gift from above. In this case, this is God's presence, right? And so this is kind of this is from Antelope Valley in the southwest United States, but you can kind of think of this as the burning bush, right? Like God says, I'm going to dwell among my people, eventually dwell within my people. And you're going to have to negotiate this. This isn't going to be instantly okay. And then this is the point where Solomon finishes the temple that his father David started, and the glory of God comes to dwell in this temple, like the glory of God dwelt in the burning bush, right? This shining pillar of light and fire. And Israel has to receives this gift. But with Wakanda, as with Israel, it's not easy. They had to develop a culture that dealt with the vibranium, right? So who gets to be Black Panther? How do we use this stuff? Do we share it with people outside of Wakanda? They had to wrestle with this. It seems like for years and years and years. And then this is the scene where T'Challa allows himself to be challenged, right, to be Black Panther. So they develop these, in some sense, very traditional, stripped down, like there's nothing supernatural going on here or allowed to happen here. It comes down to courage, integrity, intelligence, and how willing are you to sacrifice? I mean, this is how they govern themselves. This is how they actually have received this gift from above. Also in Israel, the first generations of Israel had to navigate favoritism, like who gets to be the chosen son, what does that mean for the rest of us? And so this is a painting of Joseph having his robe torn off by his older brothers. And it's a scene of conflict, because everyone thought that Joseph would be like the chosen one in that generation. They were actually wrong, it was Judah. But even that raises this question, like who gets to be that? Like who becomes kind of the special one, the chosen one out of the chosen people? And they have to, at first, fight it out, but eventually reconcile, right? And so they do that when Joseph goes to Egypt. It's an incredible saga. And there's signs of this all throughout Israel's history. Another aspect, this is one of the things I love about Black Panther, is it displays, Wakanda shows who we ought to be. And there's different ways that happens, but especially in the relationships between women and men, and how much women are empowered. So this is Shuri. She's the younger sister of T'Challa. She's the technologist, the scientist, the genius behind all the suits, the weapons, and the medicine. Right? She understands all these things. Nakia is the spy, and later we learn, because Ryan Coogler is a master of the slow disclose, like the way he discloses his characters, we learn that they're broken up because she left T'Challa. That's amazing, because female characters are often just accessories to the male hero, who they don't have any career aspirations of their own. They're like, oh, I'll drop it. I'll drop all that at the whisper of love, whatever, right? And I have no aspirations or sense of calling or vocation myself. All of that just goes out the window. But not with Nakia. She's like, nope, I'm gone. And I don't like what you're doing, so there's this backstory to her and T'Challa. The reason why they broke up is not because he chose it, it's because she did. Powerful character. And Okoye is the leader of the Dora Milaje, the women warriors who protect the king. And then Queen, what am I forgetting? Played by Angela Bassett. So she's very royal, and the way she navigates the court and stuff it's pretty cool. So you could tell, like, there's something going on in how the female characters are portrayed, and how Killmonger kills women, but T'Challa honors women. And so we'll talk about that next week. But there's a suggestion that this is how human beings ought to be. And similarly, with Israel, we see this incredible empowerment of women. Right away in Genesis 1, we see that God made men and women in his image. That was not true in other creation stories, right? In the Greek creation story, actually, somehow Zeus made men, like males, and then Prometheus teaches males how to use fire. Zeus is mad because now these men are going to be able to annoy him. And so he chains Prometheus to a rock so that a giant eagle rips his liver out every day because he regenerates so fast. And then, in order to punish the men for receiving fire, he creates Pandora and Pandora's box, which eventually leads to women. So that's the Greek creation story. That's the role of women. It's to be a punishment to annoy the men as much as men annoy Zeus. Right? That's not a great story, or as an origin story for women, that would suck. But not in Israel. Right? In Israel, it's totally different. And then you see these major leaders emerge. Miriam leads Israel in worship after God delivers the people through the Red Sea. Then there's Deborah, who gets 2 chapters in Judges, which might be more than anyone else except for Samson. But essentially, there's reason to think she's the most prominent, most honored, most wise, and most capable leader in the book of Judges. She's not there because there were no men available to lead. She's there because she has gifts, she has spiritual maturity. And then there's Huldah, who in 2 Kings, I think 22 and 24, King Josiah and all of his advisors come to her because they need advice. They've rediscovered, it seems like, the book of Deuteronomy in the temple, and it apparently hadn't been read for years and years. They're like, we've forgotten God for decades. What do we do? And so they go to Huldah for advice. And she becomes an interpreter of Scripture and the leading theologian of her generation, right? This is a woman in Israel. There's also Isaiah's wife. There's Noadiah in the book of Nehemiah, I think. Anyway, so there's other prominent women leaders. In Israel, this is what humanity ought to have been like. There's this sense that Israel is like Adam and Eve and their children if the fall never happened, right? So they're living in a garden land. What's that like? It's like Adam and Eve living in a garden land. Why? It's because God keeps wanting to bring people back to the way He made us, the way He wanted us to be, the way He wanted us to relate to one another. So it's really important to see that women are prominent, they're leaders, they're gifted, they're entrusted with a lot of responsibility in the story of Israel. In Wakanda, there's another element where there's the union of humanity and the gift. That's amazing, right? And this is the medical side of vibranium. Vibranium apparently seeps its way into herbs and plants. And there's a way they had of taking these herbs, these heart-shaped herbs, crushing them, and someone could drink them. And it gives them either spiritual powers or vibranium-laced powers, right? So you could become one with the gift. In Israel, there's this sense that you could become one with the gift of God, God's gift of Himself. And so Moses goes all the way up the mountain, meets with God, his face shines, and people get scared, and he has to cover his face. But the idea is he's being purified by God. He's taking in more and more of God with every step up the mountain, and as he soaks in God's presence, like something is happening to him. Other people experience this. Jesus, most of all, in the mountain of transfiguration. Right? So there's some kind of process of receiving God. Isaiah also gets a coal touched to his lips in his vision in order to cleanse his speech. It's another encounter with God as fire, or God as light, or taking some of God in. And then finally, there's this king of Wakanda who represents the chosen one and among the chosen people. And the king of Wakanda has a special relationship with that herb, with the liquid, and the Panther god or goddess, I'm not sure, but Bast. And the king of Wakanda has to decide between at least two visions of what is Wakanda's role in the world. So this is what Bast looks like in the beginning, in the intro credits. And that's the first Black Panther. Right? So Bast somehow unites herself with the king of Wakanda, and the king is wrapped in the mantle of the Black Panther. And somehow then this king represents Wakanda to the world, whether it's to protect Wakanda from the world or to educate the world about Wakanda, or things like that. So we see this showdown, which we'll talk about next time, between Killmonger and T'Challa, which is awesome. Jesus also had this kind of choice, and other people tried to step into that role too. So this is a quick look at between 163 and 135, so about 300 years around Jesus. There were revolutionary movements as Jews struggled against Greek, then Roman oppression. For 300 years, the uniform view was the Jewish Messiah would oust the foreigners and recapture Jerusalem. This is a greatly shortened list of such movements. So 163 is when Judas Maccabeus, he's the guy that's, the book of Maccabees is named after him. It's in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, and we could read it. It's fascinating, but essentially he recaptures Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, and sets this pattern of this is what you got to do. Then there's a guy named Hezekiah who leads a skirmish, revolts. Then there's a guy named Judas who's mentioned in Acts. Judas the Galilean leads a Jewish independence movement, and something like 2,000 Jews get crucified because they're put down. During Jesus' lifetime, this event is discussed between Jesus and some followers. Pilate puts down a revolt in Jerusalem, and Jesus is basically saying, that Pilate, he's not a good guy. And then after Jesus, there are these brothers who seem to be sons of this guy, Judas, Jacob and Simon. They lead a rebellion, and then they fail, and then in 66, another son or grandson of Judas, he seizes the temple, burns the records because everyone's in debt. It would be like burning your student debt records, right? Like going to the Department of Education and burning the thing down. Why is there this family connection? Because there's an expectation that it would have to be a son of David, right? So if you got one guy and he dies, then does he have a brother? Does he have a son? Let's just pin our hopes on that family. So that's an example. There are many of them. And eventually in 130, there's a massive rebellion, and that kind of ends the rebellions of the Jews. So this is Jesus's context, right? And so the Killmonger type characters in Jesus's world are many. And you have this militant vision of Messiah versus Jesus's vision, which we talked about already. And so discussion questions. Do we look for a better version of ourselves? Like, we would be like this if only this didn't happen. If only we were not subjected to this suffering. What would we be like? Like that, how much do we look for that? And then where? Where do we look? Because I think this is some of the attraction of Wakanda. Right? Like, here's this people who had this chance to develop without any foreign interference, without being taken over from outside. Yeah, they had their struggles, but they worked it out. What do you think?
Can you rephrase your question? Like, what are you asking?
I guess what's the attraction to this? This better version of ourselves, and where do we look for it?
So, or you're sort of like, what's the connect it back to the movie for me? So, are you asking us if we like where we would fall in the debate between Killmonger and T'Challa? Of like, what's the like?
Not yet.
Okay.
That's coming next week.
Okay.
This is more like, why is Wakanda so cool?
So yeah, so are you asking the question from a corporate standpoint or an individual standpoint?
I think a corporate one.
Okay, so I can so because I think especially when you're dealing with stories of urban minorities, it's and then you're talking about media portrayal or how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
You to think like, well, this is what would have happened if it wasn't colonization, or if white supremacy wasn't a thing.
Right.
And so this is what it would be like. It would be somewhat of a utopia, or I would feel this way about myself. And I think in some ways it's positive to see those portrayals, but in some ways it can become idolatrous. And I heard a woman. She's not a Christian, but she said, she's a black woman, and she said, I don't want to blame too many of my problems on white supremacy because that gives white supremacy too much power, or it gives it too much credit. And so, but I think the flip side is that's what could be attractive, is to think, well, if this didn't happen,
Right.
then we would be living like this.
Right.
Well, I think too, to add to what you're saying, Caleb, is that it adds value to us as people. I think when you think of something like that, you say, this is so great, and they were so great, and these things were so great, this gift was so great, their ability to do what they did with this gift was so great. And I think in us, it's kind of like we've had so much stripped from us as a race, as a group of people. So it's like to think of that, and to think like what you just said, it's like that's, to me, when I'm hearing you say that, it just adds value. It's like we've been so devalued, right, in the media, across the world. What people think when they see people of darker skin. And it doesn't matter if you're Asian and you have darker skin. You're working with, it's just the symbol of having darker skin comes from comes from predominantly African slaves comes from, you know, they're not good enough. So I think that just adds a lot of value.
Yeah.
How does this portion connect to the history of Jewish resistance that you just explained? Does it come out of that, or do you think that they were trying to find a better version of themselves? That's in there somewhere.
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, there's short little quotes that we throw around, like trust in the Lord and He will give you the desires of your heart. And you know, the way I think many Christians use that is kind of like, well, if you want to date someone, you know, or something like that. But actually, the way that the original context of statements like that in Proverbs 2 or Psalm 37 is, let's dwell here in this land, let's follow God's laws and commands and see what happens to us, right? And so as we trust in the Lord, He will give us the desires of our hearts, yes, but the subtext is He will shape the desires of our hearts. We will find ourselves becoming more and more the people that we never knew we wanted to become. Right? A people who values peace and justice and care for the alien and the orphan and the marginalized, and honoring of past generations, caring about the inheritance that we leave for our children, right? All of these things will find ourselves awakening to these kinds of desires. You know, do other people outside of Israel have those desires? Sure, I mean to some degree, but they weren't allowed to flourish in them. And that's part of the original, or that's part of the experience of Israel in the Old Testament, is they're discovering what humanity could have been like, should have been like, what God originally wanted for us, and that we would want to be the people God wanted us to be. Like, that's amazing. And I think that's a part of watching Wakanda on screen, that there's this richness of men and women and how they relate that is just refreshing and inspiring, right? Like it's just inspiring to see these men and women who are powerful characters who share the stage pretty well with one another. They're not competing with one another. But also there's this amazing reconciliation between civilization and nature, right? And so that's a huge concern today. Our energy will run out, you know, for one reason or the other. And are we doing good to the land? Huge questions. Which is why it was really, one friend of mine thought one of the saddest points in the movie was actually when Killmonger burned the herbs, right? Like, he burned the plants? And then the CIA agent, Everett Ross, says, yeah, he learned that from us, from the CIA. This is the scorched earth tactics of how do you take over another country. We do that. You disrupt the relationship people have with the land, and then they're dependent on you, right? And so, oh man, there's just so much there. There's ways that Wakandans demonstrate unity and diversity, right? That was powerful. So, just along all of those axes, or all of those threads, I think it was really amazing to watch, even as someone who, you know, who's not black. Right? So.
Thinking about if only, I would think Old Testament Israelites would be thinking, if only we can get back to our sovereign land, or if only we can you know, if only we were under Roman rule or Babylonian rule,
Right.
things would be perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, in some ways, being a people of the book was sad for them because they really wanted to be a people of the land.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
I
well,
mean, I've totally had the conversations like if only Adam and Eve didn't sin. Right? Like it's
Yeah.
always there. You know what I mean? Like just if those two people, if it had been me, if it had been the two of us, y'all would be fine. You know what I mean? Like that there's
Right.
just a matter of like those two, God just picked the wrong two to start the whole thing.
if only, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, whether we read it on the ethnic and racial level because of the history of colonization, or whether we're reading it from other or viewing it from other perspectives as well, I think there's this longing in us that if only that didn't happen, who would I be? Who would we be as a people? And I think there's something really powerful and evocative about seeing that portrayed. All right, so I'm gonna press the pause button here because the next part will be, talking about Killmonger and T'Challa. So we'll reserve that for next. It's so good, so fun.
Can't wait.
All right, thanks guys.
Universal Mississippi
Good
story.
job, Mako.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mako.
Fun. All right.
How about if do people want to share some prayer before we end?